Sometimes kindness comes disguised as a problem, and only later did we discover that it was the only thing we needed to heal old wounds that we didn't even know were still bleeding. Jacob Miller was riding down the dusty trail that cut through the Arizona desert when he heard the screams. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun hammered mercilessly over his head, covered by his worn leather hat. His calloused hands held tight reins as his blue eyes scanned the rocky horizon. I had learned over the years that ignoring screams in the desert could mean the difference between sleeping peacefully or carrying the weight of a guilty conscience for the rest of your life. The sound came from a small valley surrounded by red stones, where 3 men surrounded an indigenous woman. She was standing with her back against a rock, trying to defend herself with a small knife. The men laughed and teased her, clearly amused by her despair. Jacob recognized 2 of them. They were known in the region for causing trouble and disappearing before anyone could do anything. Without hesitation, Jacob spurred his horse and descended down the steep slope. The clatter of hooves on the loose stone made the 3 men turn around. The largest of them, a bearded fellow with a scar on his face, shouted something about it being none of his business. Jacob did not answer. He simply dismounted and walked towards the group, keeping his hands visible but ready to act. The tension in the air was palpable. The Apache woman watched him with wary eyes, without lowering her knife. She had braided black hair and wore a leather dress decorated with colorful beads. His features were delicate, but his eyes showed an iron determination that Jacob recognized immediately. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. The bearded man stepped forward, placing his hand on his waist where he carried his weapon. He said that Jacob should turn around and go on his way, that it was not his problem. Jacob replied in a calm voice that it was now his problem and that they had 2 options: leave immediately or face the consequences of their choices. The silence lasted for long seconds. The wind blew between the rocks, kicking up small clouds of dust. Jacob could hear his own heart beating, but he kept his expression calm. He had learned that sometimes the appearance of calm could be more intimidating than any show of force. The 3 men looked at each other. They clearly did not expect to encounter resistance, and Jacob's confident posture made them reconsider their intentions. The leader muttered something about not being worth the trouble and motioned for the others to follow. They mounted their horses and drove off, but not before casting menacing glances at both Jacob and the woman. When the clatter of hooves was lost in the distance, Jacob turned to the Apache woman. She still held the knife, but now she watched it with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. He asked if she was okay and if she needed help getting anywhere. She replied in broken English that she was fine, but Jacob realized that she had sprained her ankle during the fight. Without a second thought, Jacob offered to take her to where she needed to go. The woman hesitated for a moment, studying his face as if trying to read his true intentions. Finally, she nodded and put the knife away. He said that his name was Ayana and that his village was in the mountains, half a day's ride away. Jacob helped her on his horse and mounted after her. As they followed the trail that led to the mountains, he couldn't help but notice how she kept tense, alert for any sign of danger. He tried to strike up a conversation a few times, but she answered only with monosyllables, clearly still suspicious of his intentions. When they got close to the Apache village, Ayana asked to get off. She said that from then on, she could go alone. Jacob respected her request and helped her dismount. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw something beyond gratitude, a kind of mutual recognition, as if she had seen something in him that few could see. Ayana stepped back a few steps and turned to him one last time. In his native language, he said something that Jacob did not understand, but the tone was clearly one of gratitude. He touched the brim of his hat in response and watched it disappear among the rocks leading to his village. The drive back to his ranch was silent, but Jacob couldn't get the Apache woman's determined eyes out of his mind. There was something about that encounter that made him uneasy, a sense that it wasn't just a coincidence. Deep down, a part of him hoped that their paths would cross again. Dawn came painted orange and pink over the hills surrounding Jacob's ranch. He had slept little, waking up several times during the night with the feeling that something was different. It was as if the air carried an energy he couldn't identify, a quiet expectation that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He was feeding the horses in the corral when he saw a figure approaching down the dusty road. Even from a distance, he immediately recognized the upright posture and the graceful way of walking. It was Ayana, but this time she was not alone. Beside him walked a paint horse with spotted coats, with white and brown spots that shone in the morning light. Jacob left the bucket of oats on the ground and walked to the fence that demarcated his property. Ayana approached slowly, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't limp anymore. Her ankle had recovered quickly, but there was something different about her expression. His dark eyes shone with an intensity Jacob hadn't noticed the day before. When she got close to the fence, Ayana stopped and looked Jacob straight in the eye. Without saying a word, she held out the reins of the paint horse towards him. The animal was magnificent, with defined muscles and intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate Jacob with the same intensity as his owner. Jacob hesitated, confused by the gesture. He asked what she was doing, if there was a problem with the horse. Ayana shook her head and, in her slow but clear English, explained that this was a gift, a payment for the kindness he had shown the day before. Jacob's surprise was evident. He said that he had done nothing that deserved such a valuable reward, that any decent person would have acted in the same way. Ayana smiled for the first time since they met, a small but genuine smile that completely transformed her stern face. She explained that the horse was named Storm and had been trained by her younger brother before he left for the north with a group of hunters. The animal knew the region like few others, could find water where others could not, and had enough stamina to ride for days without getting tired. Jacob still tried to refuse the gift, but Ayana was firm. He said that in his culture, when someone saves a life, a bond is created that must be honored. The horse was not just a payment, it was a symbol of trust and respect. To refuse him would be a greater offense than to accept his generosity. As she spoke, Ayana approached the horse and ran her hand around its neck. The animal responded to his touch by lowering its head and letting out a soft neigh. It was obvious that there was a deep connection between them, which made the gift even more meaningful. Jacob finally reached out and accepted the reins. The moment his fingers touched the braided leather, he felt an electric current run through his arm. It wasn't just the texture of the material, but something deeper, as if he was getting much more than a horse. Storm watched him with curious eyes, sniffing his new company. Jacob reached out his free hand and let the animal sniff it before gently stroking its snout. The horse accepted the touch without resistance, as if he had known him for years. Ayana watched the interaction approvingly. He said that Tempest was a good judge of character, and that if he had accepted Jacob so easily, it was because he recognized in him someone trustworthy. He also explained that the animal had some peculiarities. It did not like noisy people, and was able to feel storms hours before they arrived. Jacob asked if she was sure she wanted to give such a valuable gift to someone she had met only the day before. Ayana replied that some people leave deep marks on our lives, even in brief encounters. She said she had seen something in his eyes when he defended her from those men, a light that many people lost after years of living in the desert. The sun was already high when Ayana prepared to leave. Jacob offered her water and food, but she politely declined, saying she had a long walk ahead of her. Before leaving, she approached him once more and put her hand on his shoulder. In a low, serious voice, Ayana said that Storm would take him down paths he never imagined he would take. That the horse knew secrets of the desert that few men knew, and that when the time came, he would understand the true value of the gift he was receiving. Jacob didn't fully understand what she meant, but nodded respectfully. There was something about the way Ayana spoke that suggested knowledge beyond her apparent years, as if she carried the wisdom of many generations. After she left, Jacob stayed in the corral, watching Storm. The horse was watching him back, and Jacob had the strange feeling that he was being evaluated. There was something in the animal's eyes that suggested intelligence beyond the ordinary, as if it understood much more than a horse should. That afternoon, Jacob decided to go on a little horseback ride to test his new companion. Storm responded to commands with impressive accuracy, anticipating movements and changes of direction even before Jacob gave the signals. It was as if the horse could read his thoughts. When they returned to the ranch at the end of the day, Jacob was sure that his life had changed irreversibly. He didn't know how or why, but he felt that Ayana had given him much more than a horse. It had given him a key to something he still couldn't fully understand. A week had passed since Ayana had brought Storm to the ranch, and Jacob was beginning to understand that her words about the horse knowing desert secrets weren't just poetry. There was something disconcerting about the way the animal behaved, as if it possessed knowledge that transcended the normal instincts of its species. On that Saturday morning, Jacob decided to ride into town to buy supplies. It was a 3-hour journey through barren, rocky terrain, but Storm seemed to know every stone in the way. Twice, the horse veered off the traditional route without any command, taking Jacob along trails he had never noticed before. The first time, Jacob tried to correct the course, gently pulling the reins to the left. Storm resisted, shaking his head and staying the course. Curious, Jacob decided to trust the animal's instinct. Minutes later, they heard the sound of hooves approaching down the main trail. It was a group of armed men riding at high speed, clearly running away from something. The second time Storm changed direction, it led Jacob to a source of crystal-clear water hidden among the rocks. Jacob had never seen that place. Despite knowing the region for more than 10 years, the water was fresh and pure, and he filled his canteens as he watched Storm drink with a satisfaction that suggested familiarity with the place. When they finally arrived in town, Jacob tied Storm in front of the general store. The owner, an elderly man named Samuel, came out to greet him and stopped abruptly when he saw the horse. His eyes widened, and he asked where Jacob had gotten that animal. Samuel explained that he had known that horse for years. It had belonged to an Apache known in the region as the Grey Wolf, a man respected both for his wisdom and for his ability to find lost people in the desert. Grey Wolf used Storm to guide him on his rescue missions, and the two were famous for never having lost a soul that ventured lost in the wildlands. Jacob was intrigued by the story. Samuel continued, telling him that Grey Wolf had disappeared months ago during a sandstorm, and since then no one had seen Storm. Many thought that both had perished in the desert, but apparently the horse had found a new purpose. On the way back, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about the story Samuel had told. If Storm really had belonged to a man known for rescuing lost people, that would explain a lot about the animal's strange behavior. But it raised other questions. Why did Ayana have the horse, and why had he chosen to give it precisely to him? The sun was setting when something unexpected happened. Storm stopped abruptly in the middle of the trail and turned his head to the left, staring blankly at a distant point between the rocks. His ears were attentive, and he let out a low, lingering neigh that Jacob had never heard before. Jacob followed the horse's gaze and saw a small column of smoke rising on the horizon. It wasn't normal campfire smoke. It was dark and dense, suggesting that something had caught fire. Even more worryingly, it seemed to come from the direction where the small farm of the Morrison family, an elderly couple living in isolation with their 2 young grandchildren, once stood. Without hesitation, Jacob gave Storm complete freedom. The horse set off like lightning, navigating the rugged terrain with a precision that defied logic. He jumped ravines, skirted huge rocks, and found passages where Jacob swore there was no way. When they arrived at the Morrison farm, they found a desperate scene. The house was on fire, and Margaret Morrison was screaming outside. She explained through tears that her husband Henry had entered the burning house to save their 2 grandchildren, who were asleep when the fire started. That had been 15 minutes ago, and since then she had not heard from any of them. Jacob quickly dismounted and assessed the situation. The roof of the house was beginning to collapse in places, and flames had engulfed most of the structure. It was an almost impossible mission, but he couldn't just stand by while an entire family disappeared before his eyes. It was then that Storm did something extraordinary. The horse approached Jacob and touched his shoulder with its snout, as if trying to communicate something important. Then he walked to the side of the house and stopped in front of a window that Jacob hadn't noticed. It was partially hidden by a vine that the fire hadn't yet reached. Jacob understood immediately. Storm had found a safer entry route. Wasting no time, he broke the window and entered the burning house. The smoke was thick, but he managed to follow Henry Morrison's muffled screams until he found him in the children's room. The elderly man had fainted due to smoke inhalation, but he was still hugging the 2 small children, protecting them with his own body. Jacob carried them one at a time to the window, where Storm waited patiently. Somehow, the horse had positioned its body in such a way as to facilitate the removal of the victims. When everyone was safely outside, Jacob looked at Storm with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The horse had not only detected danger from a distance, but had also found the best solution for rescue. It was as if he possessed an intelligence and sensitivity that went far beyond animal instinct. Margaret Morrison cried with relief as she hugged her husband and grandchildren. Henry had returned to consciousness and, despite the smoke inhaled, was fine. The children were frightened, but unharmed. The entire family owed their lives to the timely intervention of Jacob and Storm. As he watched the family gathered, Jacob began to understand the true meaning of the gift Ayana had given him. Storm wasn't just a horse. He was a guardian, a guide trained to save lives. And somehow Ayana had seen in him someone worthy of carrying that responsibility. That night, when they returned to the ranch, Jacob stroked Storm's neck with deep gratitude. He knew now that his life had gained a purpose he had never imagined, and he suspected that this had been only the first of many missions that fate would put in his path. 2 days after the Morrison farm fire, Ayana showed up again at Jacob's ranch. This time she didn't come alone. An older Apache man accompanied her, his features scarred by time and the elements of the desert. Jacob was brushing Storm when he saw them approaching down the trail. The horse immediately raised its head, recognizing the visitors, and let out a soft neigh that sounded almost like a greeting. The older man answered with words in the Apache language, and Storm trotted toward him. Ayana introduced the man as Wounded Eagle, her grandfather and former mentor of Grey Wolf. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine when he heard the name. The elder watched him with piercing eyes, as if he could see through his soul, before nodding approvingly. Through Ayana, Wounded Eagle explained that he had dreamed of Jacob 3 nights in a row. In his dreams, he rode alongside Grey Wolf through the desert, saving lost people and bringing hope where there was despair. The elder said that the dreams were a message from the ancestors, confirming that Jacob was the one chosen to continue the legacy. Jacob was silent, absorbing the words. Ayana explained that Grey Wolf was her older brother and that he had trained Storm since Colt for rescue missions. When he disappeared in the sandstorm, she knew she had to find someone worthy of inheriting her responsibility. The rescue of the Morrison family had been the ultimate test. Storm had chosen Jacob, and now the spirits confirmed this choice through Wounded Eagle's dreams. Jacob was no longer just a lone farmer. He was the new guardian of the desert. Wounded Eagle approached Jacob and placed a hand on his shoulder. He spoke at length in Apache, and Ayana translated, he was blessing Jacob and Storm, asking the spirits to protect them on their journeys and to guide their steps to those who needed salvation. Before they left, Ayana handed Jacob a small amulet made of turquoise and eagle feathers. He said that he had belonged to Grey Wolf and that he would protect him in the darkest hours. Jacob accepted the gift with reverence, feeling the weight of the responsibility he now carried. When the visitors left, Jacob was left alone with Storm in the silence of the evening. The horse watched him with eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom in the world, waiting patiently for the next call of fate. That night, Jacob dreamed for the first time of Grey Wolf. The Apache appeared astride Storm, waving at him through a golden mist. When he woke up, Jacob knew that his new life had truly begun. 6 months had passed since Jacob had become the guardian of the wilderness, and his life had found a purpose he never knew he was looking for. Storm and he had responded to 12 different calls. Lost children, injured travelers, families trapped in sandstorms. Each rescue strengthened the bond between them and confirmed the wisdom of Ayana's choice. On that spring morning, Storm showed signs of restlessness that Jacob had learned to recognize. The horse was constantly looking north, where the mountains rose against the blue sky. His ears moved nervously, picking up sounds that only he could hear. Jacob sealed Storm without hesitation. He had learned to trust the animal's instincts completely. They set out before sunrise, following a trail that led to the highest mountains in the region. The path was rough, but Storm navigated the loose stones with the safety of someone who knew every inch of the terrain. After 3 hours of riding, they reached a narrow gorge where they found something unexpected. Sitting on a rock, weak and dehydrated, was a middle-aged Apache man. His grey hair was disheveled, his clothes torn, and he held his left arm in a position that suggested fracture. Jacob quickly dismounted and approached the man. When their eyes met, he felt a jolt of recognition. There was something familiar about that face, a resemblance that immediately reminded him of Ayana. The man whispered something in Apache, and Jacob recognized one of the few words he had learned. Storm. The man was Grey Wolf. He had survived the sandstorm, but he had been trapped in a cave in the mountains with a broken arm. For months he had tried to find his way back, but his strength was running out. He knew he would die in those mountains if someone didn't find him. Jacob offered water and food to the weakened man. As Grey Wolf regained his strength, the two communicated with gestures and the few words in English that the Apache knew. Storm remained close, alternating his gaze between his two companions with evident satisfaction. During the journey back, Grey Wolf watched as Jacob and Storm worked together. I saw the connection that had developed between them, the mutual trust and the shared purpose. When they stopped to rest, he placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder and spoke words that, even without translation, carried approval and gratitude. When they arrived at the Apache village, the meeting was emotional. Ayana rushed to hug the brother who everyone thought was dead, tears streaming down his face. Wounded Eagle raised his arms to the sky in gratitude to the spirits. The entire community came together to celebrate the return of the man who had saved so many lives over the years. That night, around the campfire, Grey Wolf spoke at length with Ayana and Wounded Eagle. Jacob didn't understand the words, but he could tell they were talking about him and Storm. Occasionally, Grey Wolf would look at him and wave approvingly. Ayana eventually approached Jacob to translate. Grey Wolf was saying that the spirits had orchestrated everything perfectly. He needed to disappear temporarily in order for Storm to find his new partner. Jacob had proven himself worthy of the responsibility, and now there were 2 rescuers protecting the desert. Grey Wolf approached Jacob one last time before his departure. He put his hands on the younger man's shoulders and spoke directly in English, with a heavy accent but clear words. "You saved more than my life. It saved my purpose. Storm chose well." When Jacob and Storm left the village the next morning, they carried with them more than gratitude. They carried the certainty that they were part of something bigger, of a tradition of kindness that transcended cultures and differences. On the way back to the ranch, Jacob reflected on how a simple decision to help a woman in distress had completely transformed his life. I had gained not only an extraordinary companion, but a purpose that gave meaning every day. Storm trotted with a sure step along the familiar trail, his ears attentive to any sound that might indicate someone in need. Jacob knew that other calls would come and that they would be ready to answer. The wilderness was vast and dangerous, but as long as they were riding its trails, there would always be hope for the lost. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun set painting the sky golden. Jacob dismounted and stroked Storm's neck, whispering words of thanks. The horse responded with a soft neigh, as if to say that the real journey was just beginning. That night, Jacob looked at the turquoise amulet that Ayana had given him, reflecting on how mysterious the paths of fate were. Sometimes, saving a life was just the beginning of a much bigger adventure, and sometimes the greatest reward was not what we received, but what we were able to give to the world. Under the starry desert sky, man and horse rested, ready to answer the next call of fate. The legacy of Grey Wolf would continue, multiplied by 2, protecting all those who ventured into the wildlands in pursuit of their own dreams and purposes. If you've made it this far, this story has touched your heart in the same way it has touched ours. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming Wild West adventures, like Jacob and Storm, with this journey of courage and redemption.